Hello there again, friends. Today is 12/16/2021, and this is day 19 of the Odin Project vlog series. Today we went over Flexbox and we did the intro to Flexbox, growing and shrinking, and axes. However you want to pronounce that. We're gonna. There's no there's no exercises to this. So if you're one of the followers who are looking for banging out code, tonight is not your night. So if you want to, you can just uh, come along to the journey with us, or if you want to wait till tomorrow's upload, we'll be hitting the practice exercises in the alignment section, I believe, on number 4 tomorrow. So today's just going to be about introductions to the Flexbox, growing and shrinking, and axes, and that's where we'll start and stop, because that content's actually really meaty. Um, so I took my time on it and didn't rush it. So without further ado, let's dig into it. So it starts off with introducing you to Flexbox. Um, it gets you right into it. I like how, I guess what I said a minute ago about getting in the editor is not technically untrue. We are doing some in CodePen here. I hate CodePen with a passion, but I'll leave that for another day. But it's cool they do have some integrated CodePen on the page here. And so it starts defining here's what your HTML look like. Here's a flex container class. Here's 1, 2, 3 class for each div, and there's your individual. So the flex container would be the entire box, and then that's your div. That would be the big div, and then the child div would be class 1, class 2, and class 3. Yep. And then CSS would show you. Here's your flex container. So you have a container, and then it's telling you basically you have a container and a child. They don't call it that though. They call it container and flex containers and flex items. So here's your flex container, and it seems like so far it's always been defined first. You define your container first, and then you define your item. The flex items below it in this section. So you have a background, a border, and a height, and this defines what each div is. So each box here, and each child box inside of the container, each flex box, flex item. Sorry if I'm interchanging these terminologies. This is all very new to me. I'll preface that too. I learned a little bit about Flexbox when I did the other course, but not in depth like this. So, pardon me if I get some terminology incorrect. Feel free to comment below in the video and correct me if you would. I'll take that under advisement. So anyway, this is how you define it. And there's the height of the box. There's the border. There's your color, the pixel size, background color. And then it says a note. It's just talking about CodePen. What was that thing I read that was kind of cool? I don't remember. Anyway, so here we go into flex containers and flex items. So it breaks it down. I like the visuals because I'm a visual guy. So the flex container would be this. So this is your container definition. And they're basically saying they're showing this as examples, saying how you can have a background in your container and you can also have a background defined in your item. So here's your flex container, and here's your flex items, which are boxes inside of the bigger box. Think of it as like, again, a parent-child relationship. But they're using this to say that usually the telltale sign in the text it says is if your display : flex is in the definitions, then that's going to be your flex container. Because the item, flex item declarations will never contain a flex display, if I remember correctly from the reading. So that's kind of a tall tale way to tell whether you're in your CSS in your item or in your container. So here's another way to look at it. Here's nesting. So here is the outer blue box is a flex container, and then you have flex items inside that, and then you have nested inside of it. This is also this middle small border but rather large middle peach box is also a container because it's got two items inside of it, flex items inside of it. So it's a flex container inside of a flex container. So that's kind of interesting. And you can Flexbox is a very powerful tool, it says, and this is kind of a summary of what a page can look like when you combine the nestings. This method of creating and nesting multiple flex containers and items is the primary way we'll be building up complex layouts. The next image was achieved only using Flexbox to arrange, size, and place the various elements. Flexbox is a very powerful tool. And then next lesson goes into growing and shrinking. I spent a lot of time in this, took my time as I did with all three sections, but it goes into talk about flex shorthand, and it's saying that flex is actually shorthand for flex grow, flex shrink, and flex basis. And we've already been introduced to this because we did shorthand, if you remember, in the previous CSS exercises with margin and padding. So this is not a new concept. So I was familiar with that, but this layout is new. So here's flex. So here's what if you were to numerically type it out with no just spaces and no commas, here's what it means. Your first on flex, if you don't define it directly and just use the shorthand, you can use one number, or we'll get into that, or you can use three numbers, and your values, your first value is your flex grow, the second is your flex shrink, and the third is your flex basis. And now we're going to go into what all those mean. So your flex grow is your first one, and and that's defined as the growth factor. It's just kind of how it sounds. So when we applied flex 1 to each div inside our container, as we did before, we were telling each div to grow by the same amount. So basically flex 1 means everything's going to grow at the exact same size at the exact same time. If we instead use flex 2 to just one of the divs, then that div would grow 2 times the size of the others. So basically this flex 1 means everything's going to grow proportionately and at the same time, and flex 2 is whatever you're applying that against that item is going to grow twice as fast. And they give a CSS example of that here. And so they have here a flex container div. Here's your flex definition, flex grow 1, and there's a flex grow of 2. So for your container 2 is going to grow twice as fast. And that's this one right here. Because in HTML you can look and see div class 2 is 2, which is this one here, 1, 2, 3. Again, I'm kind of abbreviating some of this because as you guys are following along my journey, I'm kind of expecting and assuming that you're also running through this as well, especially in some of the comments I see from you guys, and I appreciate all your feedback and comments, and keep them coming. So next one we have is flex shrink. So that would be the middle number. And that's kind of what it sounds like. It's the opposite of flex grow. So flex shrink, by default, if you don't put anything in there, it will default shrink is 1, which means all items shrink evenly. So if you do not want an item to shrink, then you can specify a shrink 0. So if you put 0 in there, then it will not shrink. You can also specify higher numbers to make certain items shrink at a higher rate than normal. So just like the grow, but opposite. So if you put like a 2 in here, everything's going to shrink. Whatever's defined in that flex shrink item is going to shrink twice as fast as the ones around it. And then if you do not want to shrink, you're going to do flex shrink of 1. And you kind of see that here. Here's second values your shrink. So you got 1 and 1, which is the default value. And if you don't put anything in here, it will default to 1 or auto. And this shows another example. Note that we've also changed the flex basis for reasons to be explained shortly. If you shrink your browser window, you notice that number the 2, which is the middle one, never gets smaller than the given width of 250 pixels, even though flex grow rule would otherwise specify each element would be equal size. So you see that there. And that's because we have the flex shrink here at 0. So what happens is it looks two never gets smaller than the given width of 250, because what it does is it looks up here to the container. This is the container section, and it sees a width of 250. So it's shrinking, but it's never going to shrink below that 250, and that's why it shrunk here. But then when we went zoomed out more, it didn't shrink. It didn't shrink. Yeah, it didn't shrink anymore past that. It stayed relative to the rest of them. So, and then the last one is flex basis. Flex basis is the last value, and it's usually in a percent. And the flex basis is is initial set of a flex item. So any sort of flex growing or flex shrinking starts from the baseline. So it's the baseline size. The shorthand value defaults to flex basis 0%. Okay, so they're talking about if you change it to auto as they did in the previous example. That's why they did it. Is that with the basis set to 0, those items would ignore the item's width and everything would shrink evenly. Using auto as a flex basis tells the item to check for a width declaration, and that's why that worked. Because if they had you go through an example, like if you removed this and ran it, you see what it does. It no longer shrinks at all. It stays the exact same size through all the zooms. And that's because we don't have the flex basis in there on the parent on the container for flex shrink to look to. Sorry guys, man. Hard time talking tonight. So that's kind of that. Default value is 0. Important notice about flex basis. There's a difference between the default value of flex basis and the way flex shorthand defines if it is no flex basis is given. The actual default value for flex basis is auto, but if you specify 1 on an element, it interprets that as flex 110. And they're saying that because remember from earlier, it's that's shorthand. So when you say 1, you're actually telling it not 1 you want to have as flex basis. You're actually saying flex 1 is your first numerical value, which is your flex grow. So you have to be careful and remember that you can't simply do that. You can say flex. If you want to do flex basis, you could do flex basis colon 1, and that would work. But you have to be verbose about it. And then it talks about practice. It says in practice you'll likely not be using complex values for flex grow, flex shrink, or flex basis. Generally, you're most likely using declarations like flex 1 to make divs grow evenly and flex shrink 0 to keep certain divs from shrinking. It is possible to get fancy and set up layouts where some columns relate to each other in a specific ratio, so it's useful to know that you can use other values, but those are relatively rare. It was nice to read that in there because this, as you can tell, this, even me trying to explain it, it gets confusing really fast, and I feel like I only understand about 75% of this here. But as you can see, things can get very out of hand very quick if you don't keep track of it. But it sounds like in general, the general practice is basically to use flex shrink 0 and flex 1 is your typical declarations for flex. So that's good to know. So then we go to the next lesson and finishes up on axes. This is a short and sweet one. Basically, it's just talking about, so here's how you define your flex declaration to a column. By default, flex direction is horizontal, which is a row, but you can change it to be a column by putting that right there in your container, just like they show there as an example. And they note that when you change your direction to column, it also changes your horizontal in input. So in other words, if you put flex display flex on a div and arranges child horizontally, this is a demonstration of flex direction row, the default setting. The following example is very similar. If you uncomment the line that says flex direction column, those divs will stack vertically, and just showing you how that happens. So if we where am I at here? Okay, whatever. One thing to note is that the column would not work as expected if we use a shorthand flex 1. So try it now, and it says it's asking if you can figure it out, and I won't do it because we're kind of running out of time here. I don't want to make this super long, but basically, in a nutshell, axis is, if you're doing, by default, it's going to be flex direction is row. If you change it to flex direction is column, then everything's flipped. So these are going to go up and down. Let's see. Here we go. So if you do this, now everything goes vertically, stacks vertically, and it also changes your border and height information. So like, for example, height actually is reversed. So in normal row mode, height would be what it sounds like, the height of the box. But when you change it to vertically, now height is actually your width. I know that sounds really counterintuitive, but that's what happens, is everything gets inverted. The good part about all this is that, as confusing as that sounds, it does say in the text that this generally doesn't happen. See, changing things to vertical using flex direction columns adds complexity because block level elements default to the height of their content, and in this case there is no content. And it talks about there are situations where the behavior of flex direction could change if you're using a language that is written top to bottom or left to right, but you should save worrying about that until you're ready to start making a website in Arabic or Hebrew. So again, I went through this really fast, so there is a assumption here that you guys are going to work through this on your own. There's a lot of good content here, and I just don't want to make this video really long, especially since we're not hitting the code editor today. But basically, that everything's inverted if you do it this way, and this isn't oftentimes done. Like, flex row will be generally the most of the times the way you'll do things, but just know that flex direction column is possible, and it does invert everything and changes your basically flips your axes, so everything's opposite. So that is going to be it for this. So the next lesson, we're going to be taking a look tomorrow probably at alignment, and then there's some CSS repo exercises in there. I think it's still part of the repo we pulled down that we've been working with for quite a few videos now. So I think there's a couple things in there to go off Flexbox. So we'll be working on those tomorrow and going through alignment, and then we'll end with a project landing page. I haven't looked at that yet, so I'm sure that'll be a good one to work on. So thanks for coming on the journey with me tonight. I hope you learned something and put these things into practice in your journey as well. And until next time, see ya.